a todas y todos. Muchas gracias por su asistencia el día de hoy. Como director del Departamento de Antropología, es un placer para mí contar con la presencia del profesor Tim Ingold el día de hoy. Ha hecho un espacio en su agenda muy apretada durante este viaje para compartir con nosotros en este espacio un poco más distendido, un poco más de conversación. Quisiera agradecer también públicamente al profesor Koen de Munter, que ha hecho las gestiones para que esta reunión pudiera ocurrir. Al mismo tiempo a las ediciones Universidad de Alberto Hurtado, que han editado 2 traducciones de los libros del profesor Ingold, La vida de las líneas y Antropología como educación. Y al mismo tiempo quisiera agradecer a la Dirección de Cooperación Internacional de nuestra universidad, de la Vicerrectoría de Integración, que ha en el fondo facilitado la grabación y transmisión de este conversatorio. Por último, quiero agradecer a todas y todos ustedes por haber venido el día de hoy. I want to acknowledge to the professor Tim Ingold for being with us on this event. We know that your schedule for this trip it's very tight, so we are very pleased with your presence today. Thank you very much. So, en este momento quiero dejar con ustedes a la profesora doctora Antonella Larraín-Sutil, vicerrectora de investigación de nuestra universidad, the Vice Chancellor of Research from our university, que va a dirigirnos algunas palabras. Disculpen ustedes este spanglish atroz, pero no sabía cómo gestionarme. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, gracias Boris por esas palabras y buenas tardes a todos y todas. Good evening everyone. Welcome to this event, super important event, and I want also to thank Professor Koen de Munter and also Boris Santander, as they are making it possible to have Professor Ingold here at our university, and of course it's a pleasure to have you, Professor Ingold, in our university. Basically, I just want to say briefly that the work of Professor Ingold, of course, has been, as we all know, super influential in anthropology, but also in social science broadly. I'm a psychologist, and even if you don't imagine, Professor Ingold's work has also been very influential in some way in some sorts of psychologies. And I just want to give you a hint in the way that the work of Professor Ingold has been influential in this area. And as an illustration, I want to make 2 points in how the work of Professor Ingold has resonated with areas in which maybe you don't imagine, as I said, as psychology. The first one is because of his emphasis in movement and in becoming and in the making, and emphasis in articulating, and basically the dispute that the work of Professor Ingold has involved or represented, the dispute in terms of disputing, an ontology of the ontology of being, I see the work of Professor Ingold super important in psychology because basically he has dispute a metaphysics that state what is here, what is in front of us, as that what is important, emphasizing movement, emphasizing tendency, and so on. And even if you don't imagine how important this is for our social life, the emphasis in movement, in becoming, and in change has been super relevant. And I know that William James has also inspired the work of Professor Tim Ingold, and is also, of course, the work that has been very influential in the inception of psychology, right? The dispute of this kind of metaphysics was also a dispute at the inception of psychology and the inception of social sciences in the 20th century. But of course, as we know, most of our social sciences has been stuck in this metaphysics of substance. You know, and that is why I think that it's super like politically relevant in the sense that it involves a view not only about communities, but also individuals, of how individuals become, how individuals at the same time can change and have the opportunities to become something else. And I also think that the work of Professor Ingold is super important in another way in terms of, as you know, his work in education, because for me it's super important to, and in the university, right, we are supposed to be involved in educating people and involved with education. But the idea that education is not something that only occurs in educational institutions is super important. Humans, I see that we become humans both historically and ontologically through language, but not because of language, but because language is a medium of representation, and not because, sorry, language is a medium of representation, but because through language, as a plural and heterogeneous sediment of social experience and perspectives, we teach what we learn, and teaching is the main cultural driving and way of human becoming, I mean of the way in which we become humans. So the question about humanity, that is now very like, is like a fashionable question around the issue of artificial intelligence. The question about humanity is also the question about how we become humans, we become communities, but also how we teach each other. We learn, and many ways of living beings learn, but not so many ways of living beings teach each other. So that's super important. And we teach as we speak, we teach as we share, we teach as we move. So we make culture as we teach, and we invent ourselves by teaching each other. And I think that is something very inspirational from the work of the Professor Ingold that I wanted to point out. So even when we are part of an heterogeneous ecosystem of objects, materials, people, and so on, we invent ourselves together. And we invent ourselves together, teaching each other, talking to each other, making things together. So I think that in that sense, the idea of movement, of disputing this, as I said, metaphysics of substance, is maybe the main like message I want to bring out today, and you know, to make you see that this is not only important for anthropology, for archaeology, for social sciences, but also for sciences that study individuals, individualities, subjectivities from other perspectives. So this university, Professor Ingold, has been a place for thinking social sciences, I think, differently. It has been a place in which people have disputed hegemonic, individualistic, deterministic, mechanistic views of ourselves and our common life. And that is why I am today honored to welcome you in our humble but intellectually vibrant university, and thank you very much for being here today.
Muchas gracias a nuestra vicerrectora. Bueno, para continuar, vamos a pedir a un grupo de colegas, o hemos pedido a un grupo de colegas del Departamento de Antropología que inicien algunas preguntas para ir desarrollando este conversatorio, y en particular van a ser dirigidas por nuestro colega, profesor titular del Departamento de Antropología, Koen de Munter.
Muchas gracias, Boris. Muchas gracias, vicerrectora Antonia Larraín, por sus acertadas reflexiones respecto de la importancia de la obra de nuestro invitado. Les voy a explicar enseguida la modalidad, ¿sí? O sea, yo voy a intentar compartir con ustedes una pequeña introducción, presentación y después, quizás es mejor que ahora nos estamos facing, mientras yo esté hablando y después invitaré a Tim, I will invite Tim and the colleagues to take place here in the scenario and have a conversation, as the idea is to have a rather distended conversation also with the audience at the end. Pero me voy a organizar porque había notado otras cosas. En primer lugar, nuevamente, mucho gusto encontrarme acá con caras desconocidas, conocidas, amigos, colegas, estudiantes, muchos. Nuestro rector, Chancellor, also is with us now. Rector de la Universidad Cristian del Campo, thank you so much for joining us. Voy a, de alguna manera, en mi introducción, que va a ser en parte bilingüe, voy a hablar entre el castellano y el inglés, intentar hacer una presentación muy general de lo que me pasa a mí con la obra de Tim Ingold, ¿no? Que espero les sirva de alguna manera. Lo que me ha ocurrido con la obra de Tim Ingold se asemeja mucho a lo que él mismo plantea sobre el oficio de la antropología. No se trata de estudiar a las personas y sus entornos, sino de hacerlo con ellas. Y algo similar me ha pasado en mi relación con su obra. En ese sentido, no me considero tanto un conocedor de su obra, y mucho menos un especialista, sino más bien alguien que podría compartir ciertas reflexiones surgidas desde la experiencia de haberme dejado guiar por ellas en mis andanzas y escrituras antropológicas. What has happened to me with Tim Ingold's work is quite similar to what he himself says about the craft of anthropology. It's not so much about studying people and their environments, but about doing so with them. And something similar has happened to me in my relationship to his work. In that sense, I do not consider myself so much a connoisseur of his work, and even less a specialist, but rather someone who would share certain reflections arising from the experience of having let myself be guided by them in my anthropological wanderings and writings. Durante las últimas 2 o 3 décadas me he abierto feliz a que sus pistas teóricas conceptuales dialoguen con las prácticas, las cosas y las historias que he tenido el privilegio de ir viviendo y reuniendo a lo largo de mi trabajo en Bolivia y en Chile, de la mano de diversas familias aymara. No se trata de, a mi modo de ver, ¿no?, de aplicar las teorizaciones, de aplicar la teoría de Tim Ingold, como tampoco en rigor se hace con otras teorías, sino más bien en dejar que sus conceptos, sus reflexiones nos vayan guiando y orientando a lo largo de caminos y cuyos devenires nos tenemos que a cuyos devenires nos tenemos que someter. Over the last 2 or 3 decades, I have happily allowed myself to open up to his theoretical and conceptual insights, allowing them to engage in dialogue with the practices, experiences, and stories that I have the privilege of experiencing and gathering throughout my work in Bolivia and Chile alongside various Aymara families. It is never a question of applying Ingold's theory or concepts, as is strictly speaking neither the case with other theories, but rather of allowing his concepts, his reflections, to guide and orient us along paths whose outcomes we must submit to. Entonces, en lugar de presentar una reseña biográfica o académica, quisiera compartir brevemente con ustedes algunos hitos relevantes de la trayectoria o línea de vida de una persona cuya obra, en mi caso, ha significado un acompañamiento fundamental y constante en términos críticos, antropológicos, filosóficos, pero también afectivos, y cuya radical generosidad he ido apreciando cada vez más a lo largo del tiempo. So, rather than presenting a biographical or academic review, I would like to briefly share with you some relevant milestones in the career or life of a person whose work, in my case, has been a constant companion in critical, anthropological, philosophical, but also affective terms, and who has been and whose radical generosity I have come to appreciate more and more over time. Anna Ingold, who's also with us here today, welcome please, and Tim, dear Anna, dear Tim, from this point forward I will present a very brief bibliographical overview in Spanish for our audience, and you will certainly recognize several of the things I will mention. Afterwards, I will return to the floor, and then I will just invite the colleagues to the floor to start our conversation. So here I go in Spanish, rather quickly. Tim Ingold, Tim Ingold, vale la pena recordarlo en este mediodía, empezó estudiando Natural Sciences en Cambridge para pasar luego a la Antropología Social. I wanted to study something in which there was room to grow, where I could discover the world and myself at the same time. And that was what led me to anthropology. Aunque se hizo antropólogo de verdad, como a tantos nos pasa, ahí fuera, en terreno, como solemos decir, trabajando con los habitantes Sami, o Skolt Sami, un grupo indígena grande que vive de manera transfronteriza en el norte de Escandinavia, actualmente también en esa frontera tan tensionada con Rusia. Aquellas experiencias se plasmaron en sus estudios, podríamos decir, casi clásicos, sobre hunters, pastoralists and rangers, cazadores, pastores y granjeros campesinos. Con el tiempo, su trayectoria antropológica se fue enriqueciendo profundamente en términos teóricos conceptuales a raíz de una reflexión continua sobre cómo dejar de abordar de manera separada lo que en su época de Manchester, cuando trabajaba en la Universidad de Manchester, se conocía todavía como antropología económica por un lado y antropología ecológica o previamente ecología cultural por otro. Existe un hermoso artículo de carácter autobiográfico publicado en la revista Anuak, bajo el título From Science to Art and Back Again, The Pendulum of an Anthropologist, del 2016, que suelo recomendar a quienes desean profundizar en el conocimiento sobre Tim Ingold, o con Tim Ingold. En dicho texto, el autor describe las dificultades crecientes que experimentaba para mantener separadas ambas subdisciplinas en su trabajo académico, lo cual lo condujo finalmente a fusionar radicalmente lo que antes eran sus cursos de antropología económica y ecológica. Posteriormente, este proceso derivó en el desarrollo de lo que se podría denominar una antropología de la vida, an anthropology of life, o del estando vivo, being alive. En ese mismo artículo, nuestro invitado, Tim Ingold, relata sobre el trabajo casero de su padre, Cecil Terence Ingold, un afamado micólogo, estudioso de hongos o fungi, quien llevaba literalmente a la mesa del comedor de la casa las muestras de hongos encontradas y recogidas durante sus caminatas para analizarlas literalmente de manera casera, con el joven Timothy presente, observando, participando. Los hongos son organismos extraños que gotean, que rezuman sin claros límites. Fungi are not like that. They leak, they ooze, their boundaries are indefinable. They fill the air with their spores and infiltrate the ground with their meandering, ever-branching and ever-extending fibers. Un entendimiento que con el tiempo llevó a Tim a concluir que, al igual que los hongos, los humanos tampoco somos entes contenidos en un cuerpo, en una mente, sino que somos esencialmente personas, organismos micelianas, ¿no? Derivados de micelios, las raíces subterráneas de los fungi. Es decir, que nos vamos mezclando mediante múltiples hilos con nuestros entornos vivos, aire, bacterias, tierra, perros, entre otros, y viceversa constantemente. What if we were to think of the person like the fungal mycelium, not as a blob, but as a bundle of lines or relations along which life is lived? De ahí también su propuesta de concebir la antropología como una linealogía, convencido de que más que agentes aislados, las personas, organismos que somos y devenimos, actuamos según y siguiendo líneas de crecimiento y relacionamiento que se desarrollan en correspondencia, en atenta correspondencia, de maneras felices o de maneras tensionadas, ¿no? Con otras líneas de vida, con otras presencias vivas, bofedales, colores, el viento y el aire, entre muchas otras cosas. Estos son los temas que trabaja en el primer libro. Creo que los tengo acá, los tengo un poquito desordenados. Estos son los temas que trabaja en el primer libro que tuvimos el gusto de poder traducir y publicar aquí en la Universidad, The Life of Lines, libro a primera vista sencillo pero profundamente filosófico, antropológico. Aprovecho para mandar un abrazo agradecido al equipo de la editorial. Many thanks to the editorial team, Alejandra Stevenson, Beatriz Huidobro y Mabel Rivera. En otras circunstancias pediría un aplauso, pero bueno, se podría hacer después. Esta generosa y amplia trayectoria antropológica filosófica sobre cómo mejor abordar lo que es y podría ser la vida social ecológica, se plasmará en un flujo impresionante de publicaciones, incluyendo varios libros que han inspirado personas en disciplinas muy variadas, aunque siempre complementarias: arqueología, antropología, arte, diseño, arquitectura, por nombrar solo las más evidentes. Podemos distinguir dos principales líneas, y ahora tengo que retroceder un poco. Podríamos distinguir dos principales líneas o linajes de libros publicados. Por un lado, se encuentran los extensos volúmenes, como los que ven aquí, ¿no? Empezando con el conocido The Perception of the Environment, extensos volúmenes que recopilan ensayos científicos. Por otro, libros más breves, monográficos, de los cuales hemos podido traducir dos títulos aquí en la colección, ¿no? En nuestra editorial. Esta segunda línea concierne escritos más personales, más poéticos, que no quisiera reducir a ser meramente de divulgación, aunque esta última categoría es una que sin duda debiésemos de apreciar y cultivar bastante más. Ambas líneas sirven para sostener esa amplia conversación con nuestros colaboradores en terreno, con los estudiantes, con las y los estudiantes, con colegas, así como también con presencias no humanas, sobre cómo deberíamos llevar nuestras vidas en medio de complejas mallas de vida. Pasaré ahora al inglés, pero también quisiera pasar a invitar a mis colegas. Please, Tim, if you would be so kind and take place, I will now ask you a first question. Oscar, Paula, si está Juan Carlos, si quisieran venir a acompañar a Tim aquí adelante. She's coming, okay, please. In the middle, if you would like to. Yes. Y antes de pasar ahora a lo que sería la modalidad, ¿no?, del encuentro de hoy día, y obviamente la idea es que después de que las y los o la colega que está por llegar hayan hecho sus preguntas, que también ustedes en el público puedan obviamente hacerle alguna consulta, alguna pregunta a nuestro invitado. Dear Tim, changing point of view. Before moving on to the conversation with our colleagues, I would like to ask you a first more general introductory question about this interesting double lineage of publications. On the one hand, the compilation of scientific essays, and on the other, a line of smaller monographic books, more poetic books, of which we translated two, in our collection. These seem to be more personal, more poetic writings, bienvenida Paula, that I would not want to reduce to mere divulgation, although the latter category of divulgation is one that we should undoubtedly appreciate and cultivate much more. This will be the first part of my only question for the moment. How do you see both complementary lines, but perhaps especially the line of the more divulging books, serving to sustain the broad and urgent conversation about how we should live our lives among humans, non-humans, and other presences, since this is basically what anthropology is all about. Secondly, as the title of this meeting, this conversation today, is always new people, I would like to invite you also to briefly refer to the title of this meeting, which is also the title of your latest book. I can recall an interview that we had with you early 2024, I think. Yes, together with my colleague Felipe Trujillo as part of the Uyuaña research project that can be found on the project's website. In that research project, we collaborated with Aymara families and examined their attending to their living environments to address universal questions regarding the cosmopraxis, and specifically, we explored how, despite various challenges, they are able to sustain ecological and social practices and the significant roles played by their ancestors and mountains, in fostering intergenerational sustainability. And during our interview, I remember that you shared insights about the value of engaging with the past, always new people. The value of engaging with the past, emphasizing that, what you told us then, by following in the footsteps of our ancestors, we forge our path towards the future. No? This would be the introductory questions. Tim, please, you have the microphone. ¿Tiene que usar este también? Let's try.
Can you hear me very well, as it is?
Yes. Would you prefer to talk with the microphone? It's okay? Yeah?
And, first, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, and I'm most grateful to your Vice-Chancellor for Research, for the Head of Department, to Koen here, for having me here, and for you, and to you for all coming along. They need it? Okay. So, now, to answer your two questions, it's perfectly true that I've written several books, I've edited more, and they are of two sorts. There are three rather big fat books, which are each collections of essays. I count but 23 essays, 17 essays, 23 again, I think, in the third book. And I see these three books, The Perception of the Environment, Being Alive, and Imagining for Real, as forming a kind of trilogy, which maps out the thinking that I've been developing over the last 30 years. They're all very big, fat books, but I found that the best way to write books as a practicing academic was in the essay mode. This is because, like all my colleagues, I've had a lot of teaching to do, I've had a lot of administration to do, I've had to waste a lot of time putting together proposals for grants and dealing with them. And in such a life, you can only find little windows here and there to be able to write something. And sometimes the opportunity to write comes from an invitation to present a paper to a conference or some such specific stimulus. So I found that the way to do things was whenever I had a chance and a particular stimulus, I would write an essay. And I would think at the back of my mind that that essay might fit subsequently into a larger work. And when I got enough essays, and they all seem to fit together, well, I could put that work together. And that's how I composed the perception of the environment, which was supposed to be three separate books. But the publisher very wisely advised me to put them all together into one book, so they wouldn't compete with one another. And then I repeated the same strategy again and again. So that's how those books got written. But then there were these shorter books, and most of those arose from series of lectures, like the book called Lines, A Brief History arose from a series of lectures I was invited to present at the Museums of Scotland, the Rhind lectures. The book on anthropology and education arose from a series of lectures, the Dewey lectures that I was invited to present in the University of Rennes in France. Making, anthropology, archaeology, art and architecture, developed out of a lecture course that I developed for my own students in Aberdeen. So there were particular circumstances that led me to write those books. One exception is the book Correspondences, which is a big collection of very short essays, a sort of random assortment of things that I've often been invited to write by artists or by people putting together exhibitions as a sort of exhibition catalogue entry. And these were published all over the place. And I brought them together. And that was really fun to write, because I felt I can simply write for myself without having to bother about all these conventions of academia, all the references, all the bibliography. I can just have an idea and say, I'm going to write about this, and not worry about, that's why I call them correspondences, because it's like writing a letter to people. And I said, this is interesting, let me think about this. So it's true that there's a more personal element in that writing, and perhaps the most personal of all is the little book, The Life of Lines, which has 30 chapters, but no chapter is more than about 2,000 words long. You could write a chapter in a day, and it was a great way of writing a book. And I worked out the contents list for that book. One morning at breakfast, I was a visiting fellow at the University of Weimar in Germany, and I'd been put up to stay in a tiny apartment that used to belong to the secretary of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. So Goethe's secretary once lived in this ancient little flat, and I sat down at breakfast and wrote out the contents list for this book, and then simply followed that. So that's the history of these books. They're all a bit different, but the older I get, the more difficult it becomes to write. I think I become a perfectionist, and I find the thought of writing something very long overwhelming. I can't write long books anymore. So I write short ones, which is probably better. That was the answer to the first question.
Always new people.
Always new people.
But very shortly, because we will be getting back to it.
Yes, always new people. This reflects I've been very much influenced by reading Hannah Arendt and her reflections on what she called the crisis of education. And she was saying that the really important thing about education is that it's the process by which we introduce new people into the world. Those new people are children. And it is our responsibility as adults to introduce these new people into a world. And the key thing is that we should take responsibility for introducing those new people into a world that we know and love. Because only then will those new people be able to do the same for their children, and so on and so on. And she was arguing very strongly against the idea that education is not about introducing new people into an old world, but introducing those people into a brand new world, as if to say to people, to children, this old world, that's over, that's finished. We have a brand new world now for you, a future which will replace the past, and we will control the conditions of your entry into it by passing exams and so on, so that you will then be prepared for this brand new world that we have prepared for you. That, said Arendt, is propaganda. And I rather agreed with her, and I'm still trying to get across this idea that what is important about education, following the philosophy of John Dewey, is the continuity of life. That we have to ensure that life carries on, rather than that we can constantly replace the old with the new. So it's a logic not of innovation, but of repair and renewal and rejuvenation. That's why I called my book, the second edition of my book on education and anthropology, Old Ways, New People. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tim. Juan Carlos?
I hand over you.
Well, thank you very much. I will allow myself to take a little bit more of time for introducing my questions, but before that, I will copy my dear friend Koen, and I will try to translate. Voy a tratar de traducir en la medida que hablo, y eso puede facilitar bastante la comunicación. Well, I am very pleased to have here Anna Ingold and Tim Ingold. It's very nice to have them both, and I think that is important. Saludo entonces a Anna Ingold y a Tim Ingold y a las demás autoridades. I must say, speaking about ourselves and the world, that means speaking about ourselves and the people, hablando de nosotros y la gente, me hago la siguiente pregunta. I ask myself, what we should tell them now? What should we tell them, the people, now? And I'm thinking, in formulating this question, about animism. Mi pregunta es, ¿qué le vamos a decir a la gente ahora? Y estoy pensando en el animismo. A century ago or so, we told them that their religion was primitive and archaic, and that there were superior forms of belief. Now, antiguamente le dijimos que había que el animismo era una forma primitiva de religión. Now, we are telling them that they might be right. We tell them that mountains, rivers, and winds are active in the world, and that the relationship that they have created with their environment is not a childish fantasy, but an ontology. Ahora le decimos, ¿no es cierto?, a la gente, el animismo en realidad no era lo que le decíamos que era, sino que más bien es una ontología. This contradiction makes me think about the relationship between theories coming from the south, from the north, and thoughts arising from the south. Planteo que esta contradicción me hace pensar acerca de las teorías que vienen del norte y los pensamientos que crecen en el sur. And following Tim Ingold, it might be reasonable to proceed not by learning from, but by growing with. Digo entonces que siguiendo la enseñanza de Tim Ingold, creo que es más importante que aprender de lo que se trata es crecer con. And that's the nature of this conversation. Esa es la naturaleza de esta conversación. Based on this introduction, formulo las siguientes preguntas. Based on this introduction, I pose the following questions. Lines, that's the name of the book, and it's a very important book, and it was very influential for me, as it was an old paper written by Tim Ingold and published in 1995 in a collection that was edited by Martin Strathern, that was Building, Dwelling, and Living, How Animals and People Make Themselves at Home in the World. That was really influential for me, and it still is a reference that I will keep with me until the end. Es una referencia muy importante, el primer artículo que leí de él, después la puedo dar. My question about lines is, how thick are the lines? It's true that, as said by Tim Ingold, blobs have volume, mass, density. They provide materials. But do lines have none of those? Digo, las líneas en el planteamiento que hace Ingold no tienen o no tendrían densidad, ni volumen, ni masa. Y yo me pregunto si acaso eso es así. I believe that lines have volume. Y eso significa, no matter how thin or fleeting they are, they still have a volume. And therefore, they have dissimilar scales of operation. That means that we have different lines with different sizes, shapes, and forms, and different volumes. And that means that the precedent of some of these lines might constrain the course of other lines. So there are contradictions there. Digo que las líneas tienen volumen y por lo tanto pueden ellas establecer entre sí relaciones contradictorias, siendo algunas líneas más voluminosas que otras y otras, digamos, menos voluminosas. Esa era mi primera pregunta. That was my first question. How thick are lines? My second question relates to the process that goes with the living, and in a way, the process that goes with dying. Mi segunda pregunta tiene que ver con el proceso que va junto y paralelo al proceso de la vida, que es el proceso de la muerte. And Tim is not very outspoken with these other processes. Tim no es tan como declaradamente abierto en estos procesos donde dissolution, la disolución, fission, la fisión, tienen lugar. Here, I will quote my dear and lovely daughter Laura, who has a documentary that is called Victor and the Wolf. Victor is the caretaker of an animal that has been rescued for reintroducing him into his habitat. It's a wolf that will be reintroduced into his habitat. Este documental de mi hija Laura trata acerca de la relación entre Víctor y un lobo que ha sido recogido para ser reintroducido en su hábitat. Víctor is really attuned with the animal. Víctor realmente está en sintonía con el animal. He knows almost every detail of the wolf and his behavior. Él sabe de todo detalle del comportamiento y de la vida de este animal. Pero su tarea, but his role, his work, his job, his teaching, I would say, must sever the links, affects, and sociability with which the relation began. He must, in a way, separate himself, and basically he must teach the wolf to be afraid of humans and to create a new, independent life in his habitats. So relatedness in this case is inverted. The wolf must go on its own way. And the education process is a way of withdrawing from the relations that previously existed. So, la pregunta, el planteamiento que se hace así es que el Víctor, que es un cuidador, digamos, del lobo, tiene que deshacer, ¿no es cierto?, las relaciones que se han creado para asegurar la independencia del animal. Por lo tanto, este proceso de crear vida también tiene su contraversión o su antónimo en esta idea de romper lazos, y como un ejercicio que me gustaría pensar acerca de él. Some organisms withdraw from relationships, while others divide and break apart. So, estos procesos de división tienden, digamos, a existir en organismos que se dividen y se rompen. ¿Y how do we address these processes? I would say the tree might not want to be a boat. El árbol tal vez no quisiera ser un bote. Y aquí estoy refiriéndome, obviamente, I am referring to Malinowski and the Trobrianders. The initial rituals that are performed for the tree are intended basically to cure what's going to be severed. O sea, el rito va a ser, digamos, una forma de reparar, de cuidar, de sanar aquello que está desde el principio marcado por la separación. Every community works on a level of discretion, in a level of discrete community. So, todas las comunidades de alguna manera se forman en términos discretos, ¿no?, incluyendo obviamente a los no humanos. And therefore they operate upon the basis of differentiation, separation. The absence of lines does not necessarily mean the absence of blobs. What also matters is their emancipation from the constraints that may be imposed upon them. Digo que las líneas, o sea, los blobs, las gotas, ¿no es cierto?, esta figura, en su relación pueden sustraerse y pueden entonces buscar emanciparse de las líneas que, de lo contrario, pueden estar constriñéndolas. And finally, this is an old question that Tim Ingold must be very bored about it, but I will nevertheless pose it. Esta es la última pregunta y que seguramente Tim está muy aburrido de contestarla, pero la voy a formular de todas maneras, que es the question about history, la pregunta acerca de la historia. Lines and blobs do not constitute themselves autonomously. In the world, las gotas, ¿no es cierto?, y las líneas no se constituyen a sí mismas en forma autónoma en el mundo, but rather do so based on the provisions that they find in their past. O sea, estos organismos, estos cuerpos, se crean en base a las provisiones que Gibson, encuentran en el mundo. The destruction of social fabrics by means of colonial power and the environmental wounds to the planet are among the determinants of contemporary living processes. Digo entonces que la destrucción de los tejidos sociales por la vía de los poderes coloniales y que las heridas ambientales en el mundo actual del planeta son determinantes, digamos, de las posibilidades que tengan los procesos vivientes. And in this sense, I will invite Tim Ingold to think about that, to converse about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Johan, and for 3 wonderful questions. I'm going to start with the question about lines. And surely, as you rightly say, lines have a certain thickness and mass and volume and density. So let me just try to explain by drawing a line. Suppose I draw this line here. And now let's suppose that we want to focus on this bit here. And let's magnify it. And I'll just pretend if we suppose that we looked at this under a magnifying glass, 10 times enlarged, then we might see it like this. And it might be a bit fuzzy at the edges. And so that's a bit, and then we could magnify it again and we get something like that. And this looks now very different from what this is. But the point is that although we're looking at the same thing, if we call this a line, we're simply focusing on the movement that created it. That line is the trace of a gesture. And to see it as a line is to see it thus, as the trace of a movement. Whereas if we want to concentrate on this and see it here, well, then we're focusing on the mass, and it's not a line anymore. So there's an intrinsic relationship between the idea of the line and the idea of movement, and an intrinsic relation between the idea of blob, what I call blob, and the idea of mass. It's obvious if you just, if you're traveling by road through the countryside, and suppose you're on a bicycle or in a car, and you see the road as the way ahead, and you see that's the way it goes. It's going through the countryside that way, and you're going along this way. But suppose that your business of life lies beside the road. You live there. You're an animal that regularly crosses over that road. You wouldn't see that road as a line. You might see it as an obstacle or something in which it's a bit dangerous because you might get run over if you don't look before you cross. So the line is a particular point of view. It's the point of view of the being that is moving along it. But for other beings who have different lines, what appears to me as a line might appear as a place of danger, as a boundary, as an obstacle, or whatever. So that's my answer in a way to the first question. That it's a matter of whoops, sorry, it's a matter of perspective. Now, then, the question about fission and dissolution. This is also a big question. And I think there are two ways of looking at almost any material thing. And one is to think of it as an aggregate of parts stuck together, like a mosaic. And another way is to think of it as a lot of lines woven together as in a textile. So we could say there's the mosaic view, lots of bits stuck together, and the textile view, lots of lines woven together. And when you think of most things in the world, they turn out to be a combination of both. For example, take a simple, a wall made of bricks, right? And that wall is piled, you make it by piling up the bricks, but you have to add something. You have to add some mortar in between the bricks. Unless you add the mortar, just give it one push and the whole wall will fall down. But you add the mortar and the wall holds together. So we would say that those bricks don't just add here, they cohere. They're bound together. And what does the mortar do? It's a kind of glue that extends throughout and binds the bricks together. So you could ask, is a wall a pile of bricks with some mortar in between, or is the wall a fabric of mortar spaced out with bricks? You could look at it either way, because it's in fact a combination of both. It's the bricks that really give the wall its substance, but it's the mortar that holds it all together. Or just to take another example, when I was a child, I used to make models of aircraft and boats from plastic. You could buy a kit. I don't know whether you still buy these things. A model kit. And it would have all the parts molded in plastic, and a little booklet which tells you how they all fit together. And you would put all the parts together and it would create the model boat or the model aeroplane. But then the instructions would say, and you need one more thing. you need a tube of glue. So you say, what's this glue? Is this another part? No, it's not another part. But you have to put the glue in between the pieces, because otherwise they won't hold together. They won't cohere. And what glue does is it consists of these very long protein molecules that at a molecular level penetrate in to the plastic on either side, and when it glues, ties it together. So the glue creates a kind of fabric, a weave of lines that binds all the parts together. And just one third example is an old-fashioned book, which of course consists of all these pages that are piled on top of one another, but you also have to have a binding. They have to be stitched together, or the pages fall out. So usually you get in something like a book or a brick wall or a model kit, there is both the parts, the bits that adhere together, and then something extra that weaves them all so that it doesn't fall apart. And the thing is that when we talk about how things break or how things come undone, well, it all depends on whether you start with the idea of an adherence, where something fragments into bits, or whether you start with coherence, in which things become undone or unraveled. And unraveling, falling apart, is not the same as breaking. And I think this is important because we talk a lot about the rupture of relationships. But for example, it normally happens with kinship, that here's a family, a husband, a wife, they have some children, and as life goes on, it tends to happen that the children go their separate ways, and the sibling group grows out, but then this guy will find a wife, and this one will find a husband, and so they'll carry on, and maybe in the next generation they might come together again. So you get these lines of kinship that are in one generation unraveling, and the next generation getting knotted up together again. And that way, it weaves a fabric. And you look at a fabric like a fishing net, and the lines are both converging and diverging. And you need both the convergence and the divergence to create the fabric. So that's why I'm thinking that we have to be quite careful when talking about fission, about breakage, about rupture, whether we mean that the line is actually cut, as with a pair of scissors, or whether it's just that the lines are unraveling so that they can then be wound up again. Just a few years ago, I was at a little workshop in Reykjavik in Iceland, mostly of archaeologists, who were looking at the idea of undoing, what it meant to undo things. And it's now a published volume, and a very nice book. But it got me thinking about this question about what actually does it mean to undo something. And I realized that to undo something is itself a doing. I mean, something, when I undo the buttons on my shirt, this is something I'm doing. What are you doing? I'm undoing the buttons. So these are doing is also undoing at the same time. And it leads to something that begins to answer the third question, which is about another really important distinction, I think, and that is between division and differentiation. When I was a student in the late 1960s, I was at Cambridge, taught by people like Edmund Leach, Maya Fortis, and we were taught about kinship groups, and we were told that it is a fact of human life that everybody identifies themselves by membership of a certain group in opposition to the others who are of a different group. So I am who I am because I'm part of a collective we, as opposed to those people over there who are them. So there's a division between us and them, and that division kind of rebounds inwards onto our identity. And it's segmentary, so I would say I live in Scotland rather than England, but I live in the UK rather than Europe, but I live in the West rather than living in Europe rather than in America, and so on. So that's what we were taught, that all difference depends upon slicing the world up, dividing it. And I've realized since then that that is actually a logic that is deeply sedimented in coloniality. It is the way colonial power views the world. It puts everybody into categories, it divides them up, and then imposes its rule from above. That's the principle of divide and rule. But for actual living communities on the ground, it's quite different. Because every community is a community of difference, and social life is about living together in difference, where difference is something that is continually generated in and through the process of our going along together. It's a difference between you and me, that difference emerges within a context of ongoing relationships. Each of us develops our own voice, our own way of writing, our own way of speaking, our own way of doing things in and through our relations with others. And therefore, social life is itself a field of difference. And that, in a way, is my maybe implicit rather than explicit view about the destructiveness damage that has been wreaked by colonial power, that it has replaced an idea of a common humanity understood as an inexhaustible field of difference with the idea of a universal humanity which is homogeneous and imposed and therefore treats as less than human all of those who come under its oppression. I think that's, in a way, my answer to that question has come up this week in Congreso Futuro, where I still feel that the view of the future that is being projected, particularly by the avatars of science and technology, is one that is imposing an image of a projected humanity onto everyone else. Yes? We're having a bit of a day with spilt water.
Hi, Tim. Well, first of all, let me say I feel very inadequate and at the same time happy to be here asking questions to one of the biggest rock stars in anthropology, but I'm going to try my best. I have three blocks of questions. The first one is a wee more philosophical, and I think Koen is going to complement that part of the question, perhaps. And this was inspired, I was reading your book, the one that was translated about education, and it reminded me a lot of an Indian British philosopher that's called Jiddu Krishnamurti. And in Hinduism and Buddhism, attention also plays a very essential role in their view of how to interact with the world and carry on with life. And that has to do with a word that doesn't appear in your writings, at least in the ones I've read, that is awareness, as something that is different from concentration or distraction because it needs not a dissolution of the self, but going beyond the self, or the ego, how they sometimes call it. So it's a direct perception of the world, not mediated by the self. So this first question, taking into consideration what I just said about Buddhism and Hinduism, is who attends? Is it someone? Is it an individual? And how? And by the how, I mean the mechanism. Like what is happening in our bodies when we attend. And is, for example, attention a back and forth from the outside and the inside of a mind, or an integration of different minds, or perhaps a dissolution or reconstruction of the self in the sense of regeneration? Is attention a synonym for concentration, distraction, or something in between? And how is attention possible without mediation of an individual that attends to something or perceives something that is outside of themselves? That's my first question. I don't know if you prefer all of the questions, or?
It would be better to answer that one first, I think. Yeah, I shall answer this question first because the others are on a different theme. And I've been trying to argue for the primacy of attention. That is, that mostly primacy has been given to intention or intentionality, and attention is just a kind of offshoot or something that is derived from intention. I'm intending to do something, and so I attend to what I need to do. And I want to put it the other way around, to start from attentionality and see intentions as something embedded within that. And that, starting from attentionality, I think means starting from the premise that initially there is no fundamental distinct division between the self and the other. That this difference, this sense of, oh, I am me and you are somebody else, is something that emerges from the context of a relationship rather than something that is given a priori. And by attention, I'm referring to that intrinsic coupling of me as a perceiver with the things in the world that I'm perceiving. So I start without a division between them. I start with a coupling, then out of that perhaps arises a sense of separate identity, of me as me and the other as the other. So I don't want to begin with the division between outside and inside. But it's interesting because just over just between Christmas and the New Year, I was reviewing a set of articles that had been put together for a special issue of an anthropological journal. And it was a proposal for an anthropology of attention. The editors were of the view that attention hasn't been given the attention that it needs in anthropology, and they were proposing a view of it. And their strategy was to say that, of course, psychologically, we all know what attention is, and we can leave that problem to the psychologists. So maybe humans have some universal mechanisms for attending to things. We in anthropology, by contrast, can focus on what people have to say about attention. What ideas do they have about it? For example, in the West, people will often say in schools, for example, that attention should be focused. It shouldn't be all over the place. Or that it should be targeted on something. You should focus, you should have a target. And so in these essays, anthropologists were looking at what are these ideas about focus and target, and saying that there's some themes that keep coming up. For example, that attention, yes, that attention is focused, that it is targeted, that it is selective. And that is what attention is. And I thought, there is something slightly odd about this. Suppose you asked an archer, one of these firing arrows, competitively firing, or a player of darts, and they're shooting arrows or throwing darts at a board, and they need to hit the bullseye in the center. And you said to them, well, of course. They would say, of course, I have to focus, I have to concentrate, I have my target, and I want to hit it. But on the other hand, there's also the actual business of throwing the dart, of launching the dart into the air, the skill of firing, of shooting the arrow with the bow. And it seemed that by focusing entirely on the ideology of attention, what is left out is the actual practice of it, the actual practice of the skill of the archer, of the darts player, of what is happening when they manage to throw a dart in just such a way that the dart hits its target. So I felt that there's a danger somehow, if we want to separate the anthropology of attention from the psychology of attention, there's a danger of removing attention itself from practice and putting it inside the head as some kind of mental focusing mechanism or selection mechanism, and that this is a division that we should reject. Because there was nothing in these papers, for example, about how a mother attends to her child, or how a gardener attends to her plants, or how the craftsperson attends to their materials. That was somehow left out. And I think we need to go back into that practice, that field of practice, and think of attention not as a noun, but as a verb, to attend. And attending, then, like perceiving, is something we do. It comes from the Latin for ad tendere, means to stretch towards. It's stretching ourselves towards something. And that's an action. And I would like to see attention in the first place, I think, as an action rather than as some cognitive process in the head. Does that answer the help? Yeah? Okay. Good. Thank you.
Well, thank you. The next block of questions is about archaeology. As you know, I'm an archaeologist, and there's some of us here. So reading the same book about education, you draw a lot on Dewey, on the philosopher, right? And he says something that, as an archaeologist that studies objects, kind of stirred something in me, that's inanimate things do not regenerate. And because they don't have that ability to regenerate, they are not able to participate in this communing or attending or education. And so two things come to mind with that. What happens, for example, when rocks become sediment and sediment become rocks? Isn't that a process of regeneration? Or what happens when we absorb minerals and they help us grow the bones? Isn't that kind of a regeneration too? And the other one is, as archaeologists, our practice is constantly putting into the world things that have lost their meaning and that are buried in the past and in the sediments. And once we take them out of those sediments, they also become to life again and they're reinterpreted in a different way. So is it maybe that inanimate things do regenerate, but as humans and the way that we have been taught to look at the mineral or inorganic world versus the organic world, we can't see it? That's the first one for archaeology. And then how do we experiment and attend to communities from the past? Is attention for archaeologists, when we try to study those people, inherently biased and 2 times biased, not only by our personal perception as sort of anthropologists, but also by this veil provided by us living so far away in time from those communities, and by only studying their objects left behind, not themselves and their behaviors. And can thus we truly apprehend any type of past as anthropology? And very related to that, how do we attend or commune with a past for which we don't have any memories of?
Okay. Thanks again for these questions. I might also slightly disagree with Dewey when he says that inanimate things do not regenerate. But I think we have this word animate or inanimate. We also have the words living and non-living. And sometimes I think we are asking a word like life to do too much work for us. So people have put to me this question. In one paper, I contrasted a little tiny insect with a grain of sand. And I said these are quite different, because the insect has a developmental cycle, it has a cycle of perception and action, it can move about, do things. The grain of sand cannot. Therefore, the insect is animate, the grain of sand is inanimate. But on the other hand, I've argued that the whole world is alive, in the sense that if we put everything into the overall biogeological context, the processes that are going on, exactly as you said, if we start talking about processes of geologic processes of sedimentation, where you start with marine organisms and they're sedimenting onto the seabed and all these processes going on, then everything, whether we would call it animate or inanimate, whether it's a living insect or a grain of sand, is part of a life process that is going on throughout the planet. So you get to this problem that the grain of sand looks like it's inanimate, but is nevertheless part of a living world. And we tie ourselves up with, I think, unnecessary verbal contradictions. I mean, one solution might be simply to say, let's use the word animate for the insect as distinct from the grain of sand. Let's use the word life for the entire process in which everything we might look at comes into being, and for a while before passing away again. They're looking at things in different ways at different scales, and we can have both, I think. The second question reminded me of a classic paper by the archaeologist Cornelius Hausdorff, Swedish archaeologist. I'm trying to, have I got the name right? But anyway, it's called The Life History of a Potsherd. And he talks about how a little fragment of pottery might have started off as a fragment way back thousands of years in ancient Greece. Somebody was using a pot and dropped it on the floor and it broke. And then 2-3 millennia later, it's dug up by an archaeologist who then starts trying to reconstruct what happens, and then it goes into a museum where it's looked at with people. And one could perhaps think of that potsherd, that bit of a pot, as having this long life history that goes all the way through. And he drew a contrast between the antiquity of the object and the pastness of an object. And by the pastness, he really meant the story that you can tell, which goes all the way from the moment when a pot was first made to the moment today when somebody might be looking at a fragment in a museum and beyond. That is the story we tell. And the question is whether archaeology is really about the antiquity of things, putting them in their place, their time, their moment, and the site where they're excavated, or whether it's really about the pastness of things. And I think there's much to be said for for thinking about pastness, but it's contrary to the standard archaeological notion of what the archaeological record is, because in the record, everything is placed in its particular time, place, date. So it's a question of what we consider the past to be, and whether we think of the past as something that is over and finished and behind us, or whether we think of the past as something that is in some sense also in front of us. And we're talking earlier about old people, new ways, about the Aymara ways of thinking and so on. For them, the ancestors are ahead, as I understand it correctly. So other people in non-Western societies would very commonly, I think, distinguish between ahead and behind, or between coming and going, but not between past and future. And this idea that there's a past and there's a future, and that they're divided by the horizon of the present, which is now and our time, is a very peculiarly modern idea. And it's from there that it's got itself into archaeology. And I think perhaps we should revisit that idea, the very notion of what the present is. And I think that, in a way, is also an answer to the third question. It's about how it's about the fact that our imaginations of the past are, in a way, inseparable from our imaginations of the future. A word that I like very much in English, I think the Portuguese equivalent is saudade. In English, it's longing. When you long for something. Saudade, yes. And you long for something. And you, if somebody asks, are you longing for something that you lost a long time ago? Is this nostalgia? Or are you longing for something that you want to, hoping in the future? I don't really know. That actually, at the ends of longing, the past and future merge. The difference between past and future doesn't really make sense. It's a sort of desire that doesn't have that kind of temporality that goes from here to there, but the kind of temporality of the wind or the running river that just carries on. And maybe we could adopt that kind of a temporality into archaeology as well. There we go.
That was beautiful. It deserves it. And I'm sorry to finish with the ugly question, because we are living in a very, how to put it, difficult time politically. It's affecting us in Latin America particularly, although we knew about this from 50 years ago, it's happening again. And this question has to do with that, with fascism and how we can even try to build countries with this perspective on education and attention that is based on affections that are on a more positive, like love and affection. So in your book, you speak about correspondence, right? This way of interacting between people that make us grow, and education as such, too. So, but for that, according to your philosophy, we need a common goal that implies a common interest or motivation towards something that resembles maybe happiness, I'm not sure. So if we need a common goal to make these communities work and to actually educate, is the idea of a country or a republic or even the idea of humanity as a whole possible without forcing these goals through education? And in forcing them, aren't we losing that ideal of not teaching kids by force, but by encouraging to grow by themselves in their contexts?
Thanks. When John Dewey was writing about education, he said it is fundamentally about communication, but he didn't mean communication in the sense that we understand it today. He was writing over a century ago. Nowadays we think of communication in terms of information transfer, and yes, about the commerce in information. He meant something different, and that was if you and I meet, and we need to find a way we need to find what he called a certain like-mindedness, then I would project my imagination forwards from where I am, and you would project your imagination forwards from where you are, in order to find a place beyond both of us where we can begin to see us converging, our interests coming together. So that this is an action that takes both you and I beyond where we are now in order to find a place of not congruity, but of like-mindedness, where we can begin to see how to carry on a life together. And that he thought of as the goal of education, and that's what I think of too. But because communication has a different meaning nowadays, I would use the word commoning. But the important thing about commoning is that it's not about discovering what you and everyone else has agreed on already to begin with. It's not about discovering what you all have in common, like a shared humanity, or a shared nationality, or a shared ethnic identity. Commoning is about finding a place of convergence, of coming together in difference, not of discovering a common base that you all share from the start. Fascism, nationalism, all of these that have been so destructive in human history and are still being destructive today, are founded on this idea that we, the nation, the ethnic group, have something in common which we need to defend against attack from these outsiders who have other things in common, who are not us. It gets back to this equation I mentioned earlier of difference and division. It's assuming that all difference is concentrated on a boundary between us, who are all the same on one hand, and them, who are all the same on the other. That, I think, is the basis of well, in the worst case, fascism, but of nationalism, patriotism taken in a certain sense, and it is destructive. So we need to find a way of replacing that sense of what we all have in common with a sense of education as commoning, of learning how to live together in difference. The problem then is how to, not only how to manage that educationally, but also how to institute it politically. I mean, if we thought of social life as living together in difference, then what kind of political institutions would we need? What kind of democracy would we need? It wouldn't be a democracy of counting heads, of saying, well, if 51 people say this and 49 people say the other, then we'll all have to do what the 51 people say. It's nothing to do with that. It's more thinking, as Dewey did, of democracy as a conversation, a way of carrying on together. So in the contemporary moment, I feel that our societies are being torn apart by a division between, a rupture between education and democracy. Education is still seen as an instrument of social mobility that allows for the reproduction of an elite. Democracy is being reduced to the will of the people, the fascist idea of that common blood and soil that certain people share. So they're being torn apart. Education is blamed by the Democrats for elitism and cosmopolitanism. Democracy is blamed by the elite for fascism. We have to bring democracy and education back together again, which is why Dewey's book, Democracy and Education from 1916, is so relevant today, because that's exactly what he's talking about.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much. Thank you also, I forgot to introduce Paula Ugalde for your very inspiring questions and so much admiring your fluent English. I would love to achieve one day in my life. Tim also for these important reflections. And I think, well, I'm thinking about the audience. There might be also some questions. We are running out of time, or more than that even, but I think the last questions, at least as what is concerning us here at the podium, Oscar Toro, another colleague of archaeology of our department, is going to present, are directly related with what you were just talking about, the relationship between education, democracy, and so on. But please, Oscar, go ahead, and then, of course, we will try to make some time for some questions in the audience.
Gracias, Koen. Thank you very much, Tim, for having this opportunity to having you here. As Koen said, we'll ask you a couple of questions about education and how this topic relates to what we do here in the university mainly, which is teach. Based on your paper, 2008 paper, Anthropology is not ethnography, when you said that teaching anthropology or archaeology in this case, when we teach them, we tell students that anthropological and archaeological practice occurs in other places with other people, but we do not consider the very act of teaching entails a practice, both for us in this case, for teachers, and for students too. And in that sense, how do you see the way in which we educate and the role of education within our disciplines today, in archaeology and anthropology mainly? Complementing this broad question, maybe arose others, such as, what do you think that we should maintain and change in our teaching methods? How might we put a non-linear maybe or hierarchical education into practice in our disciplines? To mention some of the other questions that came to my mind. I don't know if I placed the next question already.
Yes, this is the big bag.
Okay, and a more general question, more related with this crisis of education that you mentioned earlier. What do you think that are the main challenges of universities for the 21st century? Considering the tensions that snatch education as the center of this human grid that we call university. I'm thinking, for example, in our accreditation system, in dealing with mental health problems, both our own mental health problems and those of students. the diversity of our students. Some came from a difficult family context, and so on. So there are both at the question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I shall try to be brief. The time is running out. On the first question, the academy, including universities, has been very adept at trying to maintain its own boundaries, to maintaining the boundaries of the academy as against the rest of the world, so as to maintain its preeminence in the production and dissemination of knowledge. And one of the reasons why I find the way in which anthropologists talk about ethnography these days so problematic is that I think it actually serves to reinforce this boundary between the academy and the rest of the world. So we have conversations within the academy with colleagues, with fellow researchers, with students. Out of these conversations, all sorts of ideas emerge, perhaps most of our ideas. We also have conversations, if we're anthropologists anyway, with all kinds of people that we meet beyond the bounds of the academy in a region that we call the field. And all sorts of ideas, understandings, knowledge, grows out of those conversations too. And yet we say of the first conversations, oh, that's just part of my research, my work as being an anthropologist. Of the second we say, no, that's ethnography. And I think there's a double standard here, which means that ultimately those ethnographic conversations are to provide material for, as fuel for the conversations I'm going to have within the academy. It is ultimately a colonizing move, and I feel that anthropologists have been very reluctant to address the inherent coloniality in their idea of ethnography. If you were really going to be to get rid of that, you would have to admit that your conversations with professors, with students, are just as ethnographic too. But who would say of a student sitting in a classroom in a lecture, who would say of you lot here, would any of you say, I'm doing an ethnography of Ingold? You wouldn't, I don't think. You'd say, no, actually we're having quite a good conversation here. So students are not doing ethnography on their professors when they go to listen to their lectures. So why should we be doing ethnography on other people when we listen to what they say? So there's something that needs to be addressed here. And I think we have to try and encourage an understanding of education in which there's not a division between the teachers on the one hand and the students on the other, but that there are teachers who are also students, and students who are also teachers, who are carrying on together in contexts such as a classroom or a seminar room, trying to figure out how to live in this world, which is the problem that all of us are faced with. One of the best statements I found of this is in the classic work of Paulo Freire, the great Brazilian educationalist, in his Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he says it's not that you don't have students and teachers, you have student teachers and teacher students, and they're carrying on along in the same way together. And we need, I think, to go far beyond decolonizing the curriculum and the rest of it in order to try and establish this as a modus vivendi of scholarship within educational settings. And that applies to the much bigger question of what is going to happen to the university. The tragedy of higher education today across much of the world is that it has been co-opted by the states and corporate industry in pursuit of their economic ambitions within a global neoliberal regime. That is leading to the collapse of the original purpose of the university. So most of our university managers these days have no idea anymore of what the true purpose of a university is. That of scholarship, of bringing people together to argue over matters of truth, beauty, how to live together in societies, and so on and so forth. So the challenge is enormous. Some of my colleagues argue that the universities are already so corrupt and most of them are close to bankrupt, that we should just let the business model of the university is unsustainable, so we should just let it collapse and then perhaps build something else in its place. My view is rather that we have all these universities, we have all these wonderful people working in them, we have all these students and facilities, so we need to be able to transform the universities from within, and that means being able to say what their purpose actually is. And the lesson I have learned is that in doing this, you will not get any help whatever from people in power. The only way to do it is from the ground up, through student teachers and teacher students working together to re-establish what a university really, for the future, really should be like. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Tim. Please, dear audience, if there would be any questions. Boris?
Thank you so much for your talking. I love you. We can criticize a lot of the educational system, the actual educational system, and we can say, oh, I would like to like the educational system be more like Paulo Freire imagined. But I ask you, how you imagine a perfect or more perfect educational system or educational institution?
Yeah, okay.
I think that we will
Okay.
put together your questions
Put together.
to
Yeah,
get time.
that's better. Yeah.
Okay. Have to here.
Hi, huge fan too. I wanted to ask, in the beginning, Professor Koen mentioned about the construction of the book of lines about your father and his work with fungi. So I wanted to ask a little bit about that. I really like fungi. I do my ethnographic work around fungi and indigenous communities. So in meshwork, the meshwork is like a mycelium, like World Wide Web. But I wanted to ask, like about the spores, like sporas. Which place do they take in the life of lions? Are they a line? Are they like the way of the meshwork to continue, or are they something beyond that? So that was my question. I don't know if I can ask another one or just one. No, one, just one. Thank you.
Hi, Tim. It's truly lovely to have you here in our school, so thank you for coming. I wanted to ask, and maybe this we could lump with the question that my peer over there also posed, but hearing you talk about Dewey, talking about democracy as conversation. I just like specifically am like thinking of this kind of weird hypocrisy that I feel like sometimes floats around the university space, especially in anthropology, which like romanticizes the field as this place where we like connect with people and learn from those connections, and then the classroom where you present those connections but are negating the connections you're obviously feeling between your professors and your peers. And there's this like beautiful intergenerational energy there that I think is extremely pedagogical, and I have felt it at times in like those conversations that spin and kind of bounce between students or among students and professors, and that kind of like that stretching that you're talking about with the dart, like the fingers have to, you know, like make a subtle movement, and it's like when you can articulate that to a professor or vice versa or to a peer, it's like being open about what's actually happening. But it feels like working from the ground up, as you said, like I almost wonder if you have specific like dreams or thoughts about how that looks in a classroom on like a class level. Yeah.
Okay, so in fact these questions are connected in a rather interesting way. The first question really is what would be if I could dream as to what would be the perfect educational system, what would it be? And I think the parallel I would draw is with the public library. A public library is there in the middle of its community, its town, or its city. It's a place where anybody who wants to find out about something or learn about something can go, where they'll meet with people who know the books in the library and can guide them to what would be a good thing for them to read, to pursue their interest, and where they can come back to where they live, enriched by what they know. And they can do that at any time of life, from young children to the elderly. And I would like a university to think of a university as something like that. The library just has books. A university would obviously have books, but a lot more as well in terms of people, facilities, to do all kinds of things. But it would be there to serve its region, to serve the people who live around and about the citizens of that city and in the land, the countryside around. It is quite interesting that in the present day and age, where universities are ranked, the top ones and the bottom ones, the top-ranking universities are ones that exist as gated communities that won't have any contact whatever with ordinary people outside, whereas the lowest-ranking ones are the ones that actually work hard on building connections with their surrounding region. It shouldn't be like that. It's all upside down. So that's I think, my answer to the first question. On the second, about the fungi, I mean, it is the case that my dad could never completely understand what it was about anthropology or why I wanted to do it. But when I tried to explain, I said to him that, well, anthropology is to the social sciences what mycology is to the botanical sciences. That is that fungi just don't behave as organisms are supposed to behave. And instead of being easily classified and put in boxes and so on, they spread all over the place and do extraordinary things. But botanical sciences want to classify everything and put everything in their boxes. And it's the same in the social sciences. And what made anthropology different for me is precisely because it's interested in the unruly spread of relationships all over the place, things that can't be, lives that can't be contained or boxed up or classified. And that's where I think the parallel is. And you asked about what to do with the spores. And in a way, it's an example of another question that I was trying to ask myself, that and it was about the relationship between the meshwork of lines that percolate the earth, with the fungi, that's the mycelium, and the atmosphere. The spores are shooting about all over the place in the atmosphere. They get fired off by the fruiting body of the fungus, and they shoot off in all directions, and they travel on the air. So they're part of the air, the spores are part of the air we breathe. And I was thinking, it's a bit like breathing in and breathing out, that when I breathe in, I gather the world into myself, and when I breathe out, I propel it all out into the air. The fungus is doing something like that. It's gathering up and then sending all these spores out and doing. When you swim, and you swim with the breaststroke, there's the bit where you do this, and then the bit where you do that. You first gather up, and then you push yourself forward, and that's common, I think, to almost every form of life. This oscillation between a gathering in and a pushing out, and so I was thinking in terms of that. That's where the spores come in. How to? I mean, the third question is about what actually happens in a classroom, and in a book about generations, I've made a contrast between what I've called the academic posture and the posture of companionship. The academic posture is one where I'm the teacher here in the front of the room, you're all rowed in here, we're viewing each other face to face. I'm telling you, this is the knowledge, there it is on the PowerPoint slide, you are supposed to receive this knowledge, and then you will show you've received it by passing your exams. That's the academic posture. The knowledge is going from my head to your head. The posture of companionship is one where both I and you are carrying along in the same direction, as though we were walking down the street together, sharing the same view ahead, other things, the same things behind, and we're sharing understanding as we go along. I've found, particularly in small group teaching in classrooms, in tutorials, things like that, that you can have a real conversation in that form. It's much more difficult in a large lecture setting just because of the constraints of the architecture. But there are things you can do. One thing, for example, is I love to use a blackboard and chalk. When you're standing with a blackboard and chalk, you have to stand with your back to the students as you write on the board, but that actually means that you and the students are facing in the same direction. And as you're talking, this idea begins to take shape on the blackboard, and everybody's joining in the formation of this idea. How different that is from the PowerPoint presentation. For a long time, I refused. It was only with the pandemic when we had to. Up until then, I refused to use PowerPoint on the grounds that I didn't want to use a technology based on the logic of projection, which was precisely contrary to everything I thought I was doing in teaching, which is to bring people along with me. So that's really how it is.
No, but the head of the department should say the closing words. But I just wanted once again, Tim, thank you for your generosity, your generous disposition, and express the hope that this smaller university one day might become similar to the local libraries you mentioned. Just let's cherish this hope. Boris, please. We have a lunch programmed, but
yeah, we have a lunch program now. But I want to thank to everyone here, all the students, scholars, and all the people that thinks that anthropology it's a worth work. Thank you very much.
Si algunos quieren, obviamente, acercarse del team, tenemos...